we have got some exciting things to get into today. And it's so fun because it's Christmas time, right? And there's all this traditional element about Christmas that I love. I mean, everything from the lights out there to the family routine and practices to just going out into the streets and just seeing it everywhere. I mean, I took a walk through the neighborhood last night, and it was so fun just to see all the lights up. I mean, and I'm just impressed. Honestly, I'm impressed by the people who just go all out. And we have a few of those neighbors that, I mean, it's like you can't even see their yard. It's just covered in inflatables and glowing things, and it's just like, I mean, I'm probably never going to be that guy, but I'm impressed by it nonetheless. Like, the only reason I hang lights outside is because we already have the hooks, and it's like really easy now. It only takes me like 10 minutes. But it's like, that's the hard part. But it's so cool. But it's a wonderful time of year, and I've been debating, like, okay, you know, we've been in this whole Matthew thing for like the last long time, and we're only like not even in the middle yet. It's going to be awesome. We keep working through. I'm like, do we go back and we do like the whole birth of Jesus scenario? Well, we will for Christmas Eve, just so you know. Like, you can't not do that on Christmas Eve. But today we're going to keep going through Matthew because I'm realizing as I'm thinking about it, this is the beautiful part of the story of Christmas. Yeah, he comes as a baby, and he comes because of this extraordinary miracle, but we get to keep diving into the Gospel of Matthew to see where does he go from here as he grows up. It's so cool. But before we get into that today, to continue on, I have to tell you about this article I read this week. Actually, it was last week, but it doesn't matter. Here's the article. The article was entitled, "What is Space?" Let me just say that again. What is space? And it means like outer space, like way out there. And I was like, well, that's interesting, but I don't understand most of the kind of like scientific articles, but this one was written for like children, kind of. So I'm like, I think I should read this. And so I was reading it, and it was interesting because, you know, like it's talking about how when we think of space, we typically think of the distance between mass or matter. Like if I'm standing up here, the distance between me and you guys is like space, and we would measure that space, or the distance between me and the wall, like we can measure that as space, or wall to wall. That's space. Like it's just kind of this distance between objects. And on the other hand, if you come to a space between objects and it's empty, then you might refer to it as like usable space. Like you're looking for a parking space, it's one that's empty. Like there's just nothing there. There's no other cars. Or if you're unloading and you go into the fridge and you want to put the milk away, you're like, oh good, there's space, right, for the milk. Right, as opposed to there's no space, there's no emptiness. And we think of it as like it's an absence of material or mass or objects, or it's just the distance between them. But scientifically, when they start talking about outer space, they're like, that's wrong. That's not what space is. Did you know that? I didn't either. And so, because this was a scientific kids article, they're like, we'd like to refer to space as space goo. It's not empty. It's not absent. It's not a lacking. It's just think of it like a goo, because we know that this thing called space moves. Like it stretches. It grows. It jiggles sometimes. Like it wraps. Like there's all these things that they're talking about. And I mean, honestly, this was like written partially for kids. It was a lot of fun. Still didn't understand a lot of it. But what was really interesting was he's talking about like we see this in areas where we see gravity at work. And we see how it affects specifically light. And gravity is always pulling on things that have mass. But light doesn't have any mass, right? I know, some of you are like, I don't, well, maybe. Right? It doesn't have any. But at the same time, we see light bending, and the theory behind it is because space itself is being pulled by the gravity, not the light. Isn't that amazing? This is good. Here's why I bring this up. Because right now, some of you are like, okay, maybe. It's kind of interesting. I mean, I like science. Clearly, Cory doesn't know anything about science, but I like science. Some of you are like, I don't like science. Cory might know something about it. I have no idea. I don't even care, right? Others, right, are you thinking like this is super important. Like, you need to get this right. Like, get your act together. Right? All kinds of areas on this spectrum of like this particular subject of science and space goo, all these kind of things. But here's the thing. There's an element of which it's just great to be curious. It's great to say, well, I'd like to know more about that. Is that true? Is that not true? What are the implications? Are we going to someday be able to fly through space goo and get to the other side of the universe? Right? It's great to have that mindset of saying, like, he might not be getting this right, but let's learn about it. This is really important because we're going to get into a topic today that, honestly, you're going to react to in one way, shape, or form. And it's a subject that oftentimes people handle in again, extremes. One is like, oh man, I don't even know if I believe that. Or two, oh, I totally believe that and it's everywhere. Or three, okay, maybe. But we have a tendency to react to it. And my hope as we get into it is you will approach it at the very least, especially if you're coming from a skeptical standpoint, from just a curiosity of like, okay, there's still parts of this universe that we're making sense of. What if there's more to the spiritual world around us that we also still need to make sense of? That is the goal. That's to kind of set our mindset and our attitude to say, you know what, I can allow for there being physical things that I don't understand and yet are real and I believe have answers. What about the spiritual things as well? Because we're going to dive into a whole aspect of the spiritual world and into it pretty deep because of the story that we're in, that we just want to be able to approach it at least from that standpoint of saying, maybe Jesus knows a little bit more about this topic than we do. And what's really cool about the story is that we're going to go through it through the eyes of the guys with Jesus, who are just like us, who are not convinced about the space goo. But at the same time, they're like, but light does bend. It's kind of weird how we make sense of this. We're in a growth pattern. We're learning as we go, and so are they. And so remember last week, this is part 2. Like last week was a to be continued talk, whether you knew that or not. Like we ended the story with Jesus being out in a boat with his disciples, and a big storm comes up. And remember, Jesus was sleeping in the back of the boat, right? And then the boat's filling with water. The storm's getting bigger. Finally, the disciples, in a panic, wake Jesus up by yelling at him and saying, "Don't you care if we drown?" Right? I mean, they're like angry and upset and freaked out. And Jesus just like wakes up in a huff and yells at the storm and says, "Be quiet, be still." And boom. Wind stops, the wave stops, and everything gets calm. And then he looks at his disciple and he says, "Where is your faith?" Sits down. And it says that his disciples went from being afraid to being really afraid. And they're asking this question in their fear, going, who the heck is this? Like literally, they're like, what kind of man can yell at the wind and the waves obey him? And that's the question that we have to kind of start with as we get into this topic. Because they're freaked out over like, how does he have authority over weather? Who is this man? What kind of man can he do? I mean, he didn't pray a prayer. He just got up and yelled at the wind and the waves. They're like, that's not normal. That's not even like a human thing. Even when God's with them, even when God's anointed them, even when they're a mighty prophet of God, you don't just yell at weather and it obeys. Like that's unprecedented. So what do we do with this guy? And they're terrified. They're afraid. And it's really interesting. They're afraid of him, and they're trapped in a boat with him in the middle of a lake at night. I mean, seriously, isn't that crazy to think about? I mean, I don't know if you've ever been boating in the lake or in the ocean, but just imagine it's at night, all the lights are off. Like, they don't have lights. They have no electric lights. Nobody's got a flashlight. No one's whipping out their iPhone, turning on their flashlight app, right? They're in the dark, trying to bail water out of a boat that was about to sink a little bit ago, stuck in it with this guy that they're freaked out by right now. They're like, well, I hope he never yells at me like that. Right? I mean, that's their scenario. Here's where we pick up the story. I love it. It says, so they arrived at the other side of the lake in the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus climbed out of the boat, a man possessed by an evil spirit came out from the tombs to meet him. Now, we're going to get into this concept of this evil spirit, that there is a supernatural, spiritual personality that is evil. Now, this is where we're talking to the comparison of space scoop. Whatever you think about supernatural, whatever you think about spiritual, whatever you think about evil, this is the area to be curious and to go like, okay, where is he going with this? Where is Jesus going to unravel this at? Where is this leading to? And to consider, like, does he know more about this world and this universe than we do? Can he see more than we can see? But imagine from this disciples' perspective, because they're just guys who've had a really rough night. I mean, it's rough to have a rough night just at sea or in a storm. But now they've got this Jesus issue in their mind of like, who is he? We've been following him for months, maybe even a year at this point in time, but now we're on a whole new level of like, there's more to this guy, but I'm not sure that I'm okay with it. Who are we following? And they arrived to be greeted by a guy who is described as being possessed by an evil spirit, or demonized, you might say, is another word. So here's a description of this guy. It says, this man lived in burial caves, which is a way of saying graveyard or tombs, and could no longer be restrained even with a chain. Whenever he was put into chains and shackles, as he often was, he snapped the chains from his wrists and smashed the shackles, and no one was strong enough to subdue him. So this guy has a history. He's been doing this for quite a while. The neighbors, the people, the community, their police force, right, have tried to figure out how do we subdue this guy. He's destructive, and at times they're able to. Times they're able to put him into chains, but then he breaks those chains, which is really interesting because I couldn't help but think of stories I remember hearing about people who were like on PCP back in the day who like had crazy strength, could break out of their handcuffs, like when the police would arrest them, like fight 10 cops at once, run and jump off of buildings, break their legs, get up and run off again, right? Because they weren't feeling any pain until the drugs wore off. Now, he's not on drugs, but the spiritual or the supernatural effect of this guy seems producing a fascinating result. Here we have this guy, this picture of this person who cannot be subdued, but at the same time, he doesn't fit in anywhere. He is completely on his own. He's living with the dead. I mean, the dead bodies in the graveyard. It's a crazy picture. It says, day and night he wandered among the burial caves and in the hills, howling and cutting himself with sharp stones. When Jesus was still some distance away, the man saw him, ran to meet him, and bowed low before him. Now, I'm gonna bet that if you've been around any major cities before, you've encountered somebody that kind of reminded you of this. Was talking to nobody in particular, but really loudly, maybe angrily, maybe howling for no apparent physical reason that you could tell. I mean, you've seen things like this, and we often wonder, is this just schizophrenia? Is this just a mental disorder? You know, is that what it is? Is it something spiritual? Is it something supernatural, right? And the answer is it could be either and or both. Like, it just depends on the time and the place, the person, and the story. But here in this place, it's a fascinating picture of a person who is often entirely isolated by themselves and in such a state of mental and emotional chaos that this is their behavior. And to the point of harming themselves, which is interesting in that this has become such a known phenomenon in the last 20, 30 years, even become a popular or understood that so often people harm themselves intentionally as a release from their own intellectual or mental or emotional pain. And that physical pain becomes a release for emotional pain. That it is a form of self-harm. I mean, honestly, if we could even, x-ray this room, I am sure that we would find those of us who have done these very things to ourselves, because this is not that uncommon. Life is painful. Life is hard. Life is difficult. There is hurt, and there is a odd logic in a sense, but because it works. And here is a man who is that lost to where he is howling, screaming, yelling, unsubduable, harming, hurting himself as maybe his only form of relief is physical pain. And he sees Jesus, and he runs up to him. And notice his behavior here. He runs up and he bows low before him. Now that's a very controlled and a very submissive posture. In fact, bowing is one of the terms that is used to describe worship at times. It's an attitude of saying that someone or something is greater. It's also a posture taken when you just recognize someone's an authority. In their culture, you'd bow before a king. You'd bow before a governor. You'd bow before somebody who is in higher rank than you. And he comes and he bows before Jesus. Like, they've not encountered each other to this point. So that's an interesting first step on this guy's part. And it says that with a shriek, he screamed, "Why are you interfering with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In the name of God, I beg you, don't torture me." For Jesus had already said to the spirit, "Come out of the man, you evil spirit." Now this is, well, there's a lot kind of chalked in here that we comment on, but what is really fascinating is this. Put yourself back in the mindset of Peter, James, John, Andrew, Thaddeus, all these disciples who've been in a boat with Jesus, who've had a rough night, who've been freaked out, who aren't sure who the heck Jesus is, who just landed their boat on the shore, who just were probably thrilled to get out of that boat, thrilled to be out of that boat and have a little bit of space between them and Jesus, right? Thrilled to be on dry land. And in that moment, here comes a guy running out of the local graveyard, screaming and shrieking. I mean, at that point, you're like, crud, let's just get back in the boat. Like, what kind of day is this? I mean, they're like, oh, no wonder Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record this same exact instance. They're just like, this is a rough day. We're going to remember this day for quite a while. But what is the question that they've been asking? Who is this guy? What kind of man is this? And it is a really fascinating thing because there's not very many times where Jesus ever lets anybody who's demon-possessed speak. In fact, there's not many times where you see any kind of engagement between the spiritual evil in this world and other people. There's only 2 instances in the New Testament that I can think of, and this is one of them, and this is the main one. And here he declares or cries out, Jesus, Son of the Most High God. Not as like an argument, not as if he's trying to convince anybody of anything, just simply because he recognizes Jesus. Now that is a pretty crazy thing. And frankly, Jesus doesn't really want demons being his spokesman. So he's always silencing them before this gets carried over too far. But in that moment, you've got to imagine for those disciples seeing this thing happen and listening with different ears. Ears that are trying to answer the question, how does this guy yell at weather and it obeys them? And suddenly there's spiritual madness, spiritual evil composed enough to bow down before their rabbi and call him the Son of the Most High God. Isn't that wild? I mean, what an interesting way to have this question answered of who is this man? What a frightening way. I mean, if they're already freaked out, does this make them more freaked out or does this make them less freaked out? I don't really know. I think they're just stunned watching Jesus in this moment and hearing what it is that he has to say. But this becomes a huge part of what the disciples understand Jesus to be. Because at this point, there's this process, this journey, just like all of us. We're all on this journey to understand the world around us, our lives, people, the universe, space goo, right? The whole bit. We're trying to understand God. We're trying to understand Jesus. We're trying to understand what does he want for our lives. And this is part of their journey. Like these guys are writing their story, and it's always interesting. They never write themselves into their story in a way that says, oh, we all got it right away. It was really obvious. It was like no struggle for us to wrap our heads around who Jesus is and what he's going to do and the cross and the resurrection. No, they're always surprised. They're always freaking out. They're always acting like normal human beings, the way that we all would. But it becomes really interesting that as they write the Gospels down, the story of Jesus, and eventually the letters, as these guys leading the church, pointing back to that this is one of the most important things that they finally understood was that Jesus was not just a human being, that he was actually the Son of God. One of the disciples, a guy named John, is going to write it this way later in 1 John. In one of his letters, he says, but the Son of God came to destroy the works of the devil. Now that is an interesting thing to consider for a moment. Again, depending on where you land in this idea of understanding spiritual evil, but that the New Testament assumes it, encounters it, describes it. Jesus himself does, but at this point in time, even as John is reflecting, he's pointing back that this is part of what Jesus came to address. Not to address, but to actually destroy, meaning this was a significant enough problem in the lives of the people that God loves, that without destroying this, they weren't ever going to be able to be the people that God wanted them to be. That there was a spiritual force that was real enough, powerful enough, affecting people enough, that it had to be destroyed right alongside of sin and death itself. And in fact, you can't really fully separate the human experience from these things altogether. That they all become a part of the issue and the problem and the challenge of life. In essence, what he's reminding us and what the New Testament describes is that we're all in the middle of a spiritual war. That there is a battle going on around us in the spiritual realm of life that affects the physical realm of life. Sometimes it affects the mental realm of life, the emotional realm of life, the moral realm of life. That the two engage, and it isn't that it engages in the grandiose or in the incredible visuals like it's seen in this instance. It's not like the scary movies of television, and it's not head spinning and vomiting up that split pea soup. It's not knives being thrown at you in your kitchen. It's not Satan trying to convince you that he's real because he doesn't care if you believe in him or not. It is a spiritual battle that is going on, all regarding or all wrapped around us believing and trusting in God. That's what God wants for us, is us to know him, for him to know us, for us to know his love, to trust in him. And Satan's only purpose is just to keep us from realizing that, to keep us from coming into contact with the God who made us in his own image. He's not trying to convince us of his reality. And the reminder is this, that if Satan can lead us away from God through any number of means, from sin itself, any number of temptations, any number of other ways in which we can rely on ourselves or other things in this world rather than God, he's going to use those tools and resources. Paul summarizes this in a nice little nutshell in Ephesians 6, Verse 11, he says, put on all of God's armor so that you will be able to stand firm against all strategies of the devil. And just notice in there, he says, 1, God has given you armor. Now, when do you wear armor? You guys are with me today. That's right. When you're going into battle, right, you don't wear armor when you're just watching TV at home, right? When you're on your way to Hawaii for vacation, you don't take your armor. I mean, not that any of them ever did that kind of a thing. But we know armor is for battle, right? It's uncomfortable. It's heavy. It's difficult to wear, right? But he's saying, look, God has given you armor, though. And you need armor. That means it's a requirement to be victorious because you're not on vacation. You're in the middle of a war. And if you're in the middle of a war and you don't know you're in the middle of a war, what do you become very quickly? Casualty. Yeah. Right? Because you don't have to want the war. You don't have to want to be in the war. But if it came to your neighborhood, it doesn't matter if you want it or not. It's just the reality. It's just there. And he says this, to stand firm against all of the strategies of the devil, which means that Satan himself is acting almost like a general. He's got strategies. He's got tactics. He's got ideas. He's got methods. But he's not all powerful. He can't do whatever he wants. But there are ways in which he knows how to manipulate people. And that's what Paul says if you go through all of Ephesians 6. He describes this armor that we need to be able to stand up to this. But look at what he says next. He says, for we're not fighting against flesh and blood enemies, but against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world, against mighty powers in this dark world, and against evil spirits in the heavenly places. It just says that there is a realm of spiritual evil and authority all throughout this world. And that it's affecting this world. And it's affecting people. And it's affecting how people treat people. And it's one of the answers to why there is so much evil in this world and why, as our human behavior and human nature, we can't quite seem to out-evolve ourselves. We can't quite seem to get past our own, ends justifies the means. Or what's best for me is going to outweigh what's best for other people. Why we can't seem to do better than that. And some of it's just our own sinfulness. I think that's definitely a biblical thing. But the Bible is also saying, but there is also another force of evil in this world. And if we don't pay any attention to it, we could be making a mistake. We could also be making the mistake of paying too much attention to it or thinking that it's the reason for everything. But he is reminding us that we have to put on this armor if we're going to be able to stand against it. And the armor, as he describes it, is really a lot of what we just have to understand about truth, salvation, righteousness, faith. It's putting these things on in our understanding so they become a part of our mindset, they become a part of our heart, and prayer, which is how we ultimately do battle. Because here's the really cool thing, as it said in 1 John, that Jesus came as the Son of God to destroy the work of the devil, which means this, when we're trusting and relying on him, we don't have to worry about overcoming. We're going to. We'll succeed. We'll be victorious. It's still a battle, but the ultimate outcome is found in Jesus, not in us. It's not in our strength. It's not any kind of our power. It's not in our ability to be good. It's not any of those things. We have one we get to rely on, that we get to turn to. It's all about trusting in him to overcome the spiritual battle that is going on around us. And it's interesting that Paul used this kind of interesting choice of words where he says fighting there against. The Greek, it's really, he uses a very specific word. He says wrestling. You're wrestling against. Because you and I could fight like right now. I mean, I could pick up this microphone stand and throw it at you guys, and you could like throw something back at me, and we could have a fight right here. But it wouldn't be wrestling. Wrestling would be if I was really awesome and I jumped across this whole gulf and I attacked Flavio, who's doing wrestling right now, so it'd be very foolish of me. But it's grappling. Like, you have to be face-to-face, hands-to-hand, right? It's body on body. I mean, wrestling is like there is no gap between you. And it's interesting that he chooses a very specific word because he's reminding us that this is a war and it's going to get personal. Satan is not going to respect anything about your life. He's going to want to affect all of it. And where he attacks is often the place of what we love and we care about most, our relationships. He often attacks us the areas of our weaknesses or the sources of our greatest shame, naturally. I mean, I just had a guy who was just telling me, a really great guy, who was explaining how he just experienced like an oddest attack in the last week of just lust. Directed at somebody that he's known, that he considers a friend, he doesn't have any interest in romantically, but all of a sudden, just this absolute powerful sense of lust and desire. And it so much so, he's thinking about it like, this is the weirdest thing. Like, where does this come from? And it was awesome to get to talk with him and have him be willing to share and discuss it, because it's like, these are just one of those moments where Satan loves to come in and he knows how to hit buttons in us. So often where the attack happens, it's in the emotions. It's in the desires. I mean, it doesn't have to be just lust. It can be coveting or desiring just something. We're like, it's Christmas time. I keep seeing this thing on Amazon or at the car lot, right? I mean, I'm like, I just really need that thing. I don't know why I need that thing. I just know that if I have that thing, I'll be satisfied. I want it. I desire it. Like, he knows how to hit all kinds of buttons, because he knows if we act on those things, consequences are going to follow. It's how he begins to work out and break down and destroy the very lives that we're trying to build as we follow after God. And oftentimes there's things that come over us that we don't even know where they come from. Sometimes it's anger. Sometimes it's bitterness. Sometimes it's resentment. We're like, where is this coming from? And when those moments happen, you just have to consider, sometimes it's just spiritual. Sometimes it's just a spiritual attack. And you have to know how to address it, how to put on that armor, how to pray, which is another plug-in for coming Saturday morning to prayer. Because one of the greatest things we also have is that we have each other. Nobody fights well alone. I mean, Jackie Chan does. But other than that, we don't fight well alone. We fight together. We fight as a church. We fight as a body. We fight as friends. We fight as family. We fight this spiritual battle, and we need each other to be together and to have each other's backs. That is such an important component to this, of what he's offering and what he's telling us, because this war is going to keep running and running and running around us. But Jesus came to defeat this very power. He came to defeat this evil in our life. He came to win. Now, I want to throw this out there because, again, I don't want to paint too spiritual a picture to cover a blanket statement, because sometimes when we have problems like I described, anger, frustration, it came out of nowhere, but not really. You just haven't eaten, right? Or slept well the night before, and you're like, why am I so angry? You're like, I need some protein. That's right, I forgot. It's just a physical problem. I need to eat. That's important. Sleep, right? There's a lot of stress in my life. Like, pay attention to your life. I mean, it's all those components, right? Sometimes it's moral, though. Sometimes it's, I did something really stupid yesterday, and now I'm upset about it. I feel guilty about it. I'm angry about it, and somebody brought something up, and it reminded me, right? That's not supernatural. Might be spiritual, might be moral, but pay attention to your own life, your heart. You need to come and do business with God. I mean, put that armor back on, ask for forgiveness, make amends, do what is required. And sometimes, it's just emotional. Sometimes it's just a bad day, it's just a bad day. And I just need to process it. I need to talk it out. I need to have some friends. I need to go do something fun. I need to have a change of focus. I mean, all of these things are part of life. This isn't a one problem fixes all. This isn't look for Satan under every rock. Right? I mean, they had to sail across a lake to encounter this guy. He's not everywhere. But what's really cool is that all of our hope in this and in all these aspects of our salvation come with Jesus being the very Son of God. I mean, think of Christmas, right? Isn't at the core of Christmas is this beautiful picture of the virgin is with child. I mean, has anybody else here ever been a virgin and pregnant? This is an easy one. Good. See? No hands. I can't tell if you're asleep or you're participating right now. But you got the answer right. No, there's only one, because you're like, that doesn't happen. No, that does not happen. You're absolutely right. But it happened for Jesus. It happened for him to be born. It happened for him to be able to come into this world. Let me put it this way. I like this. Timothy Keller stated it this way. He says, a great person who says, I am God, is either God or not a great person. Meaning this. Okay, if we're looking at Jesus and what does this all mean, we have to understand that if he is going to run around and he's going to claim he is the Son of God, can he still just be a great moral teacher? A guy who has some good information for us? A guy who offers us great advice, great truth? No, he can't be that, because he claims he's God. I mean, if you ever met anybody who thought they were the Son of God, this you can really raise your hand on. I have. I've met this guy. Yeah, Christian, I met the same guy at a coffee shop in Folsom, on a rainy day. He's the Son of God. And by the way, the government knows he's been here since 1956. It's a big conspiracy. It's a whole hush-up thing. We're like, oh, crap, okay. Thanks for letting us know. Enjoy your coffee. Sorry they couldn't put any whiskey in it for you, because that's what he was asking for. It was fascinating. But immediately you're like, okay, that guy just needs some help, right? That's all. But I don't think for a second he's really the Son of God. Jesus has to actually be who he says he is, or he has to be something really off. That's the scenario that he gives us. And that's what's so awesome about the Christmas story, about the virgin story, about the angels coming, about Jesus being born of a woman, but not of a human father. In fact, I'm going to give you a theology term. Are you guys ready for, this is like put on your theology nerd mind right now. All right, this is better than space goo, but it's right up there. This is a fun concept. We call it the hypostatic union. You should remember those words, because if you're ever in a conversation, you just want to sound smart, just be like, well, this reminds me of the hypostatic union. And then when people are like, what is that? Be like, oh, I got to go. And they'll be like, well, I got to Google that later. And they're going to assume you know all about it, which you might have to do your homework then. But this is a concept theologically that theologians tried to come up with, like, well, how do we define, how do we parse out who Jesus is, like how this whole thing works? But this is actually extremely important to understand for our minds. This is the part of our theology where we worship with our brains, not just with our feelings. And it's this idea that Jesus is 100% human and 100% God. Now, I'm using 100%. The theologians don't use numbers because they don't like to sound contradictory. And right now, like the math teachers in here are like, yeah, you can't have 200% person. Like, I don't know. I get that. But what we mean is this, is that he's fully human. That's actually the way they like to write it. He's fully human and he's fully God. He's completely human, meaning he's got human DNA. Like they could do a DNA test on Jesus and be like, oh, that guy's human. And Mary's his mother. Right? I mean, it's there. He's a human being. Like, that's pretty crazy. We can't figure out who his dad is. Let that sink in. Because his dad's God, right? There's no DNA there. Like, it's awesome. But here's the other side of it. He comes fully human. He's a baby who has to grow into a child, into a teenager. He has to go through puberty. He has to get pimples and have acne and probably had people make fun of him, right? All the way to grow up to become an adult. He had to experience hot, cold, hunger, tired, fatigue, stress, like all of the human experience. But because God is his father, he can go through all of that and not sin. He never had to choose sin. He wasn't born into sin. He was tempted in every way that we are for all the same reasons, but he could say no to sin because he comes with the fullness of the righteousness, the essence of God. And that's the fun theology word, is essence. You can drop that too. Oh, it reminds me of the essence of the hypostatic union. But here's why this is important. Jesus himself, he has the sinless nature of God and can act as a representative of all humanity. It means that Jesus could come and not only live this life, but when he dies on the cross as a human sacrifice, he can perfectly represent me, Cory, because I am a human, and Jesus can stand up as a human and say, God, I want to take his place. I'm not coming as an angel, not coming as some other creature. I'm not even going to take his place as the Son of God. I'm going to take his place as a human being. And not just mine, but the sin of all of the world. Because he has no sin, he can take on the responsibility of sin and not be his own. He could be the human sacrifice for us. And this is the crazy thing, that if we place ourselves underneath the authority of Jesus, we also place ourselves under the protection of Jesus. And this is a huge deal. And by protection, I don't mean that he's going to protect us from like car accidents and, famine and war and all those kind of human things. He's protecting us from the much greater spiritual things. Some of those being spiritual evil, yes. Some of it being sin, yes. But ultimately, he's protecting us from the very anger and wrath of a righteous and holy God. Because that's what our sin requires from God, is justice, is condemnation, is death. And Jesus, as a human being, can come and represent all of us as human beings and take the full brunt of death upon himself. Like, this is the story of the gospel. This is the good news. This is the picture. The only way he could accomplish that, though, was if he came as the Son of God. Do you see how that comes together? How it has to be both of those things, that you can't do one without the other. It's why actually the Christmas story is so stinking amazing. How God orchestrated that. It's also really fascinating, as you know what it means as far as sin nature, how it gets passed along from one generation to the next. It means it gets passed on by the fathers. Good job, guys. Keep passing on your sin nature. It's not the ladies. I mean, Mary was a sinful woman as much as the rest of us, but she didn't pass on her sin nature to Jesus. I mean, I don't know what we do with that. I'm just saying that's one of those things. But it's fascinating. All right, we've got to get back to the story. Then, right, so this guy bowed down to Jesus, declared him to be the Son of God. It says, then Jesus demanded, what is your name? And he replied, my name is Legion, because there are many of us inside this man. And then the evil spirits begged him again and again not to send them to some distant place. There happened to be a large herd of pigs feeding on the hillside nearby. Send us into those pigs, the spirits begged. Let us enter them. So Jesus gave them permission. The evil spirits came out of the man, entered the pigs, and the entire herd of about 2,000 pigs plunged down the steep hillside into the lake and drowned in the water. The herdsmen fled to the nearby town and the surrounding countryside. Spreading the news as they ran, people rushed out to see what had happened. This is why you can read the Bible and know people haven't changed in 2,000 years. Right? You're like, just saw a crazy car accident. I almost died. Everyone's like, let's go check it out. Wow. Oh, my goodness. Look at the carnage. This is awesome. Let's slow down the whole track. Let's rubberneck. Oh, my goodness. Look at that. Am I going to get out and help? No, I'm just going to watch as I drive by slowly. Right? I mean, it's human nature. We're like, something crazy happened? Oh, yeah, let's stop what we're doing. Let's go check this thing out. It's fun. These guys are going to hear the same thing. These herdsmen are freaking out because, I mean, these are the guys responsible for the pigs, and they're just like, well, there's no way to explain this well. Oh, I'm sorry, why did you let 2,000 pigs kill themselves and drown themselves in the lake? Like, well, it wasn't our fault. It was that guy over there. He cast out the demons. Can you imagine trying to report that to your boss? Like, no, well, I mean, we were paying attention. I swear we weren't sleeping when this happened. Like, Wow. But look at this. A crowd soon gathered around Jesus, and they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons. He was sitting there, fully clothed, perfectly sane, and they were all afraid. I mean, one, you've got to look at the awesomeness of what happened to this man. Here's this man who was so out of control, they used to try to chain him up, and that stopped working. Crying, screaming, living in the tombs, cutting himself, all these things, and now he's calm. Now he's at rest. Now he's clothed. I mean, all of it's a dramatic, crazy improvement. Sitting there in his right mind. Isn't it interesting, like when the demons are in him, they're bowing down before Jesus, but now that he's in his right mind, he's just sitting in front of him like a student. Just learning. Just being with him. Suddenly brought right into a relationship with Jesus. Eye to eye. I love that picture. And then you've got this phenomenon that carries right over from the last story of the storm. Great storm terrifies everybody. Jesus calms everybody. He's even more terrified. You've got a storm of a man, crazy, demons going into pigs, craziness, a storm, and now all of a sudden everything is calm. And the people show up and they're freaked out. They're freaked out by this power, even though this power is now being seen in absolute calm, in healing, in health, in restoration. But it's still power. It's still uncontrollable power as far as they're concerned. There's still an absolute sense of which this guy can do whatever he wants to do, apparently. And that's freaky. And that's a lot of loss involved there as well. And I love that statement, though, that here's this guy clothed and perfectly sane, and here's all the people who are like, oh my gosh, like this is terrifying. How did this happen? You know what they're asking? They're asking, what kind of man is this? How is it possible he could do this? How is it possible that this kind of change has come over this man? But this is describing exactly what we like to talk about as a church, call it finding freedom. This is what Jesus came to do. It's what he came to bring. He came to bring us freedom from the very things that enslave us, that trap us, that we get addicted to, that we can't stop doing. The things that tend to own us again and again and again, that we get stuck in cycles of repeating, that we feel powerless to ultimately to change. And we love to talk about how, like, in kind of 4 steps, but like knowing God is the first thing, that God wants us to know him, experience him, to be loved by him, to learn to love him. And the second is from there to learn and discover the process of freedom. There's all kinds of things that he wants to set us free from. And it's really incredible how practical that freedom gets. You know, it's interesting in taking this last semester to study addiction counseling, that one of the main reasons that people relapse when it comes to anything that they're addicted to, whether it's gambling, whether it's drugs, whether it's alcohol, whether it's sex, what you name it, food, all kinds of addictions. But the thing that causes the most relapse, about 35%, is just the feeling of resentment. That's it. The emotion of resentment swells up in somebody, and it is enough to trigger them right back to the thing they've been trying to get free from. Resentment. And it's so interesting because so much of what we talk about when we talk about what Jesus accomplished is this little thing that we call forgiveness. And we always talk about it in terms of us and God, but so often we forget the fact that Jesus says you need to forgive others exactly the way you want God to forgive you. Because that's how you do battle against resentment. That's how you learn to let go of things that are in the past, but it's also how you're going to practice and learn to let go of the things that are still coming. That when we get good at forgiving, we get good at being clear and free from the power of resentment in our life. And our world is just constantly in this place where as human beings, we are struggles and often victims of this resentment that we harbor and don't know what to do with and refuse to get rid of sometimes. I have a friend who wrote this book. It's actually his doctoral dissertation, and that's the title is Breaking Satanic Bondage and Breaking Free into Christ-likeness. In other words, we're talking about this idea of finding freedom. That for some of you, there is a real sense of which this stuff isn't that hypothetical. It's not like space goo at all. You've actually lived in some of the spiritual oppression. Not saying that you've been demonically impacted the way this guy in the story was, but you've seen enough of this around your own house, your own home, your own family growing up, right? In your own life, you've felt or seen this influence and the power that it has, and wanting freedom from it or even having found freedom from it. Because this is one of those things where oftentimes it doesn't show itself in a way that we all recognize, but there are times when it does because there are people that go looking for it. And sometimes it's you and sometimes it's just people around you that have gone looking for it. And we live in a world that is infatuated with the spiritual world. I mean, more and more when you ask people like what they believe in, they'll tell you they're not religious, but they're spiritual. And spiritual can mean all kinds of anything. But in a very real sense, that was the world of Jesus' time and day. Their people were religious, but that religion was also very spiritual. They worshiped all kinds of things. They practiced all kinds of forms of, hard to say magic, because magic, we all think of like Harry Potter now, and so it doesn't sound real. But ways in which to engage with the spiritual world and the power that it holds. And this is everything from the simple, almost silliness of looking at astrology and thinking about what is the sign that I'm born under? And what does that say about me and who I'm going to be in my destiny? What kind of person I am? It's giving credence and power to say this is actually carries some truth in my life. To going to the local palm reader, having them read this and tell you, because they're engaged with the spiritual world, about what your future is going to be like. All of these are things that God says again and again and again not to do. Not because they aren't real, and not because they can't be powerful, but because the source of the power isn't him. It's literally going to your enemy to tell you who you're going to be. That's the moral of the story. That's what he's trying to convey and help us understand all throughout Scripture. When he says to trust in him, to come to him, to turn your mind over to be transformed by the renewal of your mind to God, it's to understand that he will show you who you are. He will show you who you're going to become. He will show you all the things that you need to know, but it becomes a power play for lots of us to keep going to places that we can just pay for what we want. We can control what we get. And it's one of the hardest things to give up is the sense of power and control. It's one of the things that stands often as Satan's greatest tool in our life is to give us a sense of control over our own identity and destiny. Because it keeps us from thinking to ourselves that, man, we really need him. In fact, look where this story ends. It says, then those who had seen what happened told the others about the demon-possessed man and the pigs. And the crowd began pleading with Jesus to go away and leave them alone. Right, so here's this crowd. I mean, they didn't see any of this. They're just hearing now about the story of the pigs. They're seeing the guy. They're already freaked out. They want Jesus to leave. Like, you go away. And Jesus does it. Because Jesus was getting into the boat. The man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him, but Jesus said, "No, go home to your family and tell them everything the Lord has done for you and how merciful he has been." So this is really interesting. Notice Jesus doesn't get angry at the people telling him to leave. He's just not like, what a bunch of stinking jerks. What a bunch of there's no curse, there's no anger, there's no upset. He just simply says like, okay. Can you imagine being one of the disciples, by the way? Like you just got out of the boat, you've been freaked out, you saw this demon thing, the pigs died, and you're just like, hey guys, let's get back in the boat. Like, oh man. It's already been a rough day. But I love this picture. He gets back in the boat. Well, who's ready to go with them? The guy that had formerly been demon-possessed. There's this sense of which this guy is like, I am ready to go with you. Wherever you're going to go, Jesus, I want to go. I mean, if you look at how Jesus talks to people who are interested in following him, it's really interesting, right? In chapter 8, we had two examples where one guy's like, Jesus, I want to follow you. And he's like, that's fine, but look, like foxes have dens and birds have nests, but I don't have anywhere to lay my head. And we're like, okay. It's a weird way of saying, like, I'm homeless. Another guy's like, I want to follow you, but first let me go bury my father. And he's like, let the dead bury their own dead. I won't go back into that, but right, he's this story. Later, he's going to say, if you want to be my disciple, you're going to have to be willing to give up your relationship with your father, mother, sister, brother, wife, kids, your house, your property, your job. Anybody who's not isn't worthy to be my disciple. I mean, he sets this crazy high bar, and all that means is to come follow me. And I love that. Here's a guy who is right there. He's like, I have no family. I have no friends. Right? I've been living in the tombs by myself. Right? I've got no property. I've got no job. I am 100% ready to follow you anywhere you want to go. You don't have a house to live in? Not a problem. Not used to living in a house anyway. And Jesus is like, you would be an amazing disciple. Now go home. Fascinating. Here's the thing that's so cool. It's never about giving all those things up. It's simply about Jesus being the priority. It's simply about God being our authority. It's simply about my love and my worship saying, I'm going to define the rest of my life and what I am and what I do by Jesus first. And this guy's already there. Is in many ways, Jesus is all he knows. He's what has saved him. And there's just no doubt about it. But I love this, that Jesus says, look, just go back home to your family, your friends, and just tell them. We want to get the word out. Tell them what God has done in your life so that they'll understand what God can do in other people's lives. It's just like what Greg said as we sang that song about Noel. Come and see what God has done. That's what they're saying. Go tell people what God has done. And look at this. It says, the man started off to visit the 10 towns of that region. He began to proclaim the great things that Jesus had done for him. And everyone was amazed at what he told them. Right? I mean, partly you're amazed because of who's telling you. But he's sane and he's in his right mind and he's wearing clothes again. It's a big day. Imagine last time you saw this guy naked running through town with like chains on his body. You're like, oh man, I don't want to run into him. He shows up at your house, knocks on your door. Fully dressed this time. Wants to tell you what God's done in his life. You're like, okay, maybe I'll listen. Through the closed door. This is awesome. You know what happens 6 chapters later? Jesus comes back. Same place, same towns. And when the people find out Jesus has come back, they all come out to him. And this time, it says they do what everybody always does when Jesus shows up. They start bringing him their sick and the other people who are being oppressed. They don't say, go away from us. They say, oh, you're the guy that healed that guy. You're the guy that set that guy free. You're the guy that brought this calm, stability. You're the one that changed his life. You're the guy that came and demonstrated the very mercy of God. Like, isn't that awesome? I mean, a whole town, a whole group of people that were too freaked out, they wanted nothing to do with Jesus, but this one guy stays and just shares his story. And you know what I love is, like, you think, what does this guy know about Jesus? I mean, does he know hypostatic union? Sadly, he does not. No, he doesn't know any of that stuff. He doesn't know theology, right? He doesn't know the redemption story and where this thing's even going yet. He knows one thing. He knows what he's done in his life. He knows what he's changed about him. And Jesus is like, great news. That's all you need to know right now. That's where it starts. That's what other people need to know, by the way. These people aren't even ready for me. They don't need to hear the whole story. They just need to hear what has happened in real time, in a real way. Why you love, why you worship, why you keep coming. like what God has done in you. Like, it's an amazing thing because not everybody's ready for Jesus right away. I mean, this is true today. I was thinking back to a girl that's in the crew club that as we've been sharing through the Gospels and going through sin and the cross and the resurrection as we get into closer to Christmas, and just asking her, like, what do you think about all this? And it was so really precious. I mean, she's just like, honest, it's just all new. Like, I don't know what to think. I don't know how to feel about all this. I don't know quite how to take it all in. I'm just listening and I'm just absorbing it as fast as I can. And that's an awesome thing because she keeps coming back and keeps listening to more. But that's the world we live in, is like you can tell people about Jesus with the bullhorn on the sidewalk. It doesn't necessarily get in. You can heal a man who's been possessed by demons and send all the demons into pigs and create a whole show, and people are still not like, okay, we get it, right? It doesn't matter. Like, people just, it takes time. We're all just people. And God is at work in all of us at different paces. But here's the great news. The people that you know that haven't been ready for Jesus in their life, they might just need to hear your story first. Which is really interesting, right? Because it doesn't mean you have to tell them Jesus' story. Just your story with Jesus. Because you're real to them. Probably. Hopefully. We've been doing our disciple-making classes, and one of the things that we talk about is how do you share your story, what God is doing in your life? And this last time we did in October, it was so fun. We had about 6 people, and we had one lady in particular who came, and she let me know right from the get-go. She was coming, but she was upset about it. I'm like, well, that's good because I'm making you come. No, I'm not making her come at all. I'm just like, well, why are you coming? Like, why are you upset? And she's like, I never wanted to be one of those people that was always like telling people about God and being all religious and hitting people over the head with their Bibles, and I just didn't want to be one of those people. And I'm like, okay, well, that's fair. We don't want to make you one of those people either. She's like, but Jesus definitely wants me here. So I'm here, but I'm not happy about it. I'm like, fantastic. I mean, we call that obedience. You don't have to like it, right? I mean, the disciples are not excited to get back in that boat with Jesus. I guarantee it. They're like, oh my gosh, okay, we're in it, but I'm not thrilled about this. But it was awesome as especially these ladies were sharing their stories about what Jesus has done, how many of them realized, oh my gosh, how much our stories overlap. I mean, there were some dark things in there, some backgrounds, some sinful things, some hurtful things, some victimization things. I mean, painful things, and yet the story was, look what God has done. Look at how he's been merciful to me. And it's crazy, but every time I hear anybody share their story, everybody stops with like, that's it. That's my story. It's not that big of a deal. But the rest of us are going like, that's a big deal. You know why? Because you're really real to me. And how God has worked to you is now a little bit more real of like what God can do. It helps me see and understand Jesus more as I hear you tell your story of how you've met him, how you've encountered him, and how he's changed you. And that's it. It's just your story. It's a beautiful and wonderful thing, and this is the great challenge, and this is this simple idea of as Christmas rolls around, do the people in your life, your family, your friends, your coworkers, the people that you're going to celebrate with, that you like, that you might hang out with, that you might do a party with, do they know your story? I mean, they may know you go to church. You might even slip them an invite card, which you should, but do they know like why you come? Not why you like Bayside, but why you like Jesus so much. What he's done for you, how he's shown his mercy to you. Maybe not your life story, but maybe just it's been how he continually does, how he gives you hope, how he gives you courage, how he speaks truth, whatever it is, how he's given you purpose. I mean, it's your story. But that's a great thing to tell. I mean, it maybe even your kids need to hear that story. Here's why I follow Jesus. Maybe it's your adult kids or your grandkids that need to hear that story. I mean, they're going to come Christmas Eve because it's family and it's tradition, but do they know why it's part of your story? Tell them. Make it a part of your time. Make it a one-on-one time, whatever fits in your family, but take this as a challenge to tell your story, to help prepare them for, man, you know what? Maybe I want to be more interested in who this Jesus guy is. Maybe it's not just about church. Maybe it's not just about a service. Maybe it's not even about great lights and great music, but maybe there's something more real. Because it's affected my mom or my dad or my brother or my sister in such a real way. Tell our stories. Such an awesome and powerful thing. So I hope that you'll take that challenge. And if you're like, I don't even know how to share my story. We're going to be doing another class in January. Disciple making, it's awesome. It's actually fun. It's challenging, but it's fun. It's so good. It's like prayer on Saturday. This advertisement brought to you by Prayer on Saturday. Let's pray. Father God, we love you and are so excited that we get to be part of the story, that it's not over, it's not done, it's not just in the past. You continue to be at work. Father, I just pray for this, your people in this room, Lord. I know we're all over the place, God. Some of us are here and we're excited about you and we love you, and this is a challenge, Lord God, and I just pray that you give us that courage to take a next step, to share it with some people around us, even if our family is believers, but just to share our own story, to begin to get serious about practicing that. Lord, and for others that are in this room or just maybe more at the beginning of just like, man, it's just new, and God, I just pray that you would continue to show them how much you love them, how great your mercy in their life is, and your power to set them free, and that they would invest themselves more and more to you to find that freedom. And for others that are in this room, Lord, that may just be like skeptical and doubtful or confused, or just honestly, it's just new and they don't know what to do with it, Father, just pray you keep bringing them back, that you bring them to yourself, that you bring them to people who want to share their stories, that they can see and hear more of how real you are, how powerful you are, how great your love is. Father, we thank you so much that you would send your Son into this dark world to bring us light, to bring us joy, to bring us peace, all in the form of Jesus. A man that we could see, that we could wrap our heads around, that we could understand, to die for us, to die for things that we can understand, the things that we've done wrong, things that have been done wrong to us, to give us a promise of life, of love, of mercy, to introduce us to you. Father, please just fill us today as we head out of this room, that we would be people who walk in your strength, people who walk with our eyes open with wisdom, people who see opportunities around them just to love others in your name and to share your goodness and your joy. Thank you. Thank you that we all have stories to tell in you, Jesus. We pray this all in your great name. Amen.